Hello, delegates. Really nice to have a chance to chat with you this way. Would be better to be there in person, of course. I always love my visits to PEI. I love Charlottetown, but this is a good second best. I have a chance to talk to you directly. And gives me a chance to thank Karen, your president, your excellent president. I know that she's doing a great job for you. But she also does a great job on the National Executive Board. She's one of our strong members, and we really appreciate the work that she does at the national level. Any of you remember when COVID wasn't something that was constantly preoccupying us? It seems like it was a century ago, doesn't it? But it's still very much with us, I'm afraid. And in some parts of Canada, it's very much with us. In Alberta, it's a crisis. In Saskatchewan, it's a crisis. They had to bring in the army. They've got people being sent out of Saskatchewan into Ontario because they don't have room in the hospitals. Manitoba is very difficult. New Brunswick is very difficult. And we were talking the other day, and it occurred to us that there's an interesting coincidence going on, that those four provinces have the four worst governments in Canada, the most anti-labor right-wing governments in the country. And it's a sort of object lesson, isn't it? That kind of right-wing politics, that anti-people politics just doesn't work. And it isn't going to keep people safe. I mean, there's a big issue across the country, and that's the COVID vaccine mandates. The details vary, of course, but it's in every province now. Every province has some variety of a COVID vaccine mandate. And that makes sense. Requiring people to be vaccinated before they go to work makes good sense. Because what it says is that the right of the majority to have a safe workplace is more important than the right of the minority to endanger that workplace. You know, if we had somebody arguing they had a right to bring a loaded gun into work, we would all recognize that as being foolish. And somehow, because it's a vaccine, the debate is supposed to be different, but it isn't. Workers have the right to a safe workplace, and unions have a duty to make sure that the workplaces are safe. So we are in general favor of a vaccine mandate. The details are important. If people are being unfairly treated as a result of the vaccine mandate, then of course we should intervene. But in general terms, fighting a vaccine mandate is fighting for the right to make workplaces unsafe. And it just doesn't make any sense. Now, we've looked, and there are people who want unions to challenge vaccine mandates, and it's against the human rights or it's against the charter, and it isn't. We've checked with our lawyers, we've checked with lawyers across the country, and there is almost no chance of a challenge to the vaccine mandate being successful. There's been, I think, 3 challenges now that got into court, lasted maybe 5 or 6 minutes, and then they were thrown out because there's just no toehold there for a legal challenge. It's interesting that one of the people that was challenging the vaccine mandate in Saskatchewan, he was leading the charge. He went to court, and I think that court case lasted 10 minutes, and he was tossed out because he had no case. But he's now in intensive care in Ontario because he got COVID so badly, and they couldn't handle his case in Saskatchewan because they were out of room. Kind of ironic, and nobody would wish that on anybody, but he's the guy that was trying to fight against the mandate, and now must realize that that was a very foolish fight. Meanwhile, we're kind of arguing a little bit in places about whether everybody has to be vaccinated. And there are too many countries in the world where that argument doesn't make any sense because not enough people can be vaccinated. They can't afford to get vaccines for their population. So Canada has an international obligation, and we've been a little slow to live up to that obligation. We need to make sure that people in less wealthy countries can afford to get vaccinated. It's a moral duty, it's a human duty, but it's also a way of keeping Canada safe, because the more that COVID grows in countries that are unprotected, the more chance there is for new variants to come along and threaten us all. So both on a moral basis, on a self-interest basis, we should be helping other countries with their vaccine mandate. One of the offshoots of COVID, as you all know, is work from home. We had bits and pieces of that sort of experimenting across the country before COVID. And after COVID hit, it wasn't an experiment. Many people across the country were sent home, told to work from home. And we had no collective agreement language that we could rely on to protect them. We had no agreement language about safety at home. Whose job is it to make sure that the home is safe if people are working from home? Whose job is it to make sure that the house is well enough equipped, that they've got the equipment that they can actually work successfully? Whose job is it to make sure that a household full of young children has room for somebody to work and keep care of the kids at the same time? There's a lot of questions that we didn't have any answers to. And now as people are going back to work, unfortunately, we probably know that it may not be permanent. We may have another wave coming. And in any event, there's now going to be lots of experimenting with how many people have to be in the office, how many people can be there part-time, and so on. And we need to develop concrete collective agreement language that will keep our members safe from abuses from the employer when they're working from home. Well, we've got lots on our plate, but we're right now dealing with three overarching serious issues. The first is the climate crisis. And I use that word advisedly. It is a crisis. Last summer, we had people dying in the hundreds in BC because of the excess heat in a place where they've never experienced that kind of heat before. We've set records for 3 and 4 years now in the number of forest fires that we have to fight. We've got floods and we've got tornadoes and we've got hurricanes. This is a disaster in the making. It's a crisis. And we have an obligation because every single one of our members lives in this world and on this planet, and they need to be protected against the worst excesses of climate change. Plus, we've got a lot of members that are on the front lines. You know, we've got people in EMS workers that have to go to disasters and try and help people out. We've got people fighting those forest fires right across the country. We've got healthcare workers who are going to be facing new threats that they never had to deal with before. So for us, the climate crisis is a big issue for our members. Representing our members fairly, we need to fight the climate crisis as hard as we can. And Bert Blunden, who's the Secretary Treasurer of the National Union, is going to be in Glasgow just at the end of this week. There's a big international UN conference called COP26. They're going to be looking to see what governments are prepared to promise to each other in terms of fighting climate change. And we'll be there, part of the Canadian delegation. Bert will be working to keep the government of Canada honest and aggressive and courageous in dealing with international cooperation on fighting climate change. The second major overarching issue for us is the wealth and income inequality crisis. It was bad before COVID. It was terrible before COVID. It got to the point that business leaders were saying this is a crisis and has to be dealt with. It got so bad that Stephen Harper, who was about as right-wing a prime minister as we've ever seen in this country, he said that income inequality has gotten so bad that it is causing serious problems and has to be dealt with. We've been saying that for years, but finally other people have caught up to us and understanding just how bad it is. But COVID made the situation worse. Canada's billionaires increased their wealth during the first year of COVID by $53 billion. And over the last decade, the wealth of Canadian billionaires has doubled. Well, we barely held our own in the front lines of working people, even with strong unions to protect them. So we know how to fix the wealth and income inequality. I was meeting with Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland a couple of months ago, and I said, you know, this isn't a complicated issue. We know how to deal with it. Strong labor laws, strong labor rights will be a part of it. Fair taxation will be a part of it, and strong public services will be a part of it. And she said, Larry, I agree with you. This is not a complicated issue. It can be resolved. So we need to put pressure on to make sure that our government lives up to that. And finally, we've got a crisis looming. Not quite looming because we're already seeing it in some places, but it is looming in other places. And that's the crisis of austerity. Governments across Canada are going to say, we spent all of our money on COVID and now we need to tighten our belts, which means your belts, and we can't afford new wages and we probably can't afford all the social programs we got. We need to tighten up. We know that's coming. In fact, in Alberta, before COVID was over, the Alberta government was trying to roll back the wages of healthcare workers by 4 and 5%. So we have to get the message across that, first of all, we can't afford austerity. We can't afford it economically. It will drive us into the ditch. And we can't afford it socially because it will ruin our society even more. And we can afford to avoid austerity. The simple fix to the problems of spending are income. And the federal and provincial governments have cut taxes so much that there's tons of room for tax increases in Canada. And if we increased our taxes, we can afford the social programs and we can afford the wages of public sector workers. We can afford to do lots of things in this country. We are a very wealthy country, and that wealth is not being shared equally. There are people at the top who have far too much, and they need to pay taxes accordingly. So we have those three big issues that we're dealing with. We're developing tools to fight austerity. We're going to be working to deal with the best arguments we have. We're going to be trying to show to governments that they don't need austerity, that there are other alternatives. We're going to show the public that those services that they so valued during COVID are equally important when we come out of COVID, and that they deserve the right to a good healthcare system. They deserve good education. They deserve good social programs right across the board. But there's another thing that we have to be paying attention to when we're fighting austerity right now, and that's a new and yet old thing in our economy, and it's called inflation. For probably a decade now, we haven't had to think much about inflation because it was relatively low, 2.5%. And now it's looking like it's back on the table, and it's looking like it's going to stay high for the balance of this year and into next year. And if you put those two things together, austerity on the one hand, which is we can't afford public sector wages, and inflation on the other, that's a very bad combination. Because what it means is if you take a zero at the bargaining table now, and the rate of inflation is 4.5%, that means that our members are taking a wage cut, a real income cut of 4.5%. So that's a really dangerous combination, and it's something we have to guard against. So we maybe have to dig out some of the old tools, like some of you will remember a thing called COLA, which is cost of living adjustment, so that we would bargain and say that if inflation gets higher than we expect, we have the right to keep up with inflation as a result of cost of living adjustment. So maybe we need to start bringing things like that back into our collective agreements. And one other new thing that we're looking at post-COVID that we haven't had to think about for quite a while now is across the board shortages of staff. We knew about it in healthcare, in particular healthcare professions before COVID. There was some real problems of understaffing in a lot of areas, but now it seems to be an epidemic of jobs that can't be filled. And it's very serious. In healthcare, there's jobs in the allied health professions that can't be filled. There's nursing jobs that can't be filled. We've got people working in long-term care homes where they can't find enough staff. We know the root cause of it. The root cause of it is that employees have been not fairly treated over the years, and that includes healthcare employees. And if you've been in the hospital working on the front lines during COVID, and you're sick and tired of endless weeks and putting yourself at danger, exhausting yourself every day, then it's not surprising that we're seeing people leave, and maybe not surprising that people are reluctant to join the profession. But we need to sort it out, and we need to speak on behalf of working people when we say to our governments, you need to address this crisis and you need to do things that are going to resolve it. And look, we all know one of the ways to resolve it, called pay people fairly. Make the jobs decent, make sure that they have a quality of life, make sure that they're not abused, make sure that they're protected at work and that their working conditions are good. That will do a lot to alleviate the jobs crisis. And that's the same old rule that if you pay people poor wages and you give them poor working conditions, don't be surprised if they're kind of less than enthusiastic about applying for that job. So, my friends, lots on our plate, as always. But what happened during COVID was interesting, that the public saw our arguments with new eyes. They saw how important public services are. And we've done some polling, and we found that over 80% of Canadians want our governments, our public service, to take strong and effective action against climate change. That's a lot of people. That's 80% of the population. You don't get that kind of consensus very often. 75% of the public wants to make sure that there is adequate childcare and affordable childcare right across the country. And I think it's 90% or about that of Canadians think that the for-profit should have no place in long-term care, that should be a public service, it should be delivered as a public service the same way that Medicare is. So the COVID epidemic was not good in any way, but it had a silver lining in the cloud, and that's to really have demonstrated to the Canadian population what we've always known, how important public services are. We'll be told that It's all very interesting, but we can't afford it. That's not right. The governments of the UK, the government in the US, they've looked at the situation and they say one of the answers is fair taxation. And they're increasing corporate tax rates, they're increasing taxes on wealthy individuals. And one of those governments is led by a very conservative prime minister. So the message is not very hard to figure out. We need fair taxation and we need quality public services across the board. So we need to seize the moment. We need to seize the public perception of the importance of public services, which we know they're right about, and we need to force the issue. It won't be easy, will it? But you know what? You, the members of UPSE and the members of the National Union across the country, you were called heroes sometimes, and that's a good word. You put yourselves at risk, you worked hard, you made sure that the public was defended to the very best of your ability. You exhausted yourselves in some cases. You went to work when it was dangerous to do that. We know that you played just a heroic role in dealing with COVID on behalf of the Canadian public. So with that example, surely the leadership knows that we have to play our role too, and we have to lead the way and help work towards a really strong revival of quality public services right across the board. You've showed us how it can be done. So yeah, it won't be terribly easy. I'm trying to remember the last thing that unions did that was important, but was easy, and I can't come up with a very long list. If it's hard, that's just takes us a while to do it, that's all. We still get it done. So with you working with us, and with working across the country with all of the members of the National Union, we have the capacity to put Canada back on track. Thanks very much for listening. Have a great convention.